Aloha friends, and welcome to part 22 of our Exodus series. Part 22, which is also the conclusion of a series that began in March of 2025. I mean, we weren't even the same people then. So I am honored and excited to share with you today the conclusion of this series. This one is called The Nature of Freedom. Before we begin, you may notice here in the background this mysterious stone structure, which I'm not going to tell you where I am, but if you want to take a guess at it, you can leave your guess down in the comments, and I'll let you know who's the closest. Christopher Sprinkle, you've probably got the best chance at sorting this one out, but I'll give you a hint. It's out here at the beach somewhere, and it is legitimately mysterious. Nobody knows for sure exactly what it's doing there. At least that's what I hear from this historical placard I just read over there. So, submit your guesses. Let's see how well we know the region. So, as we conclude this series, it seemed to me wise not to introduce more content, but to take a look at the whole narrative arc of the Exodus, the central meaning-making myth of the Hebrew people. If we take a look at the whole arc of the narrative, if we zoom back, we see that it's a movement from life under the constriction of oppressive systems to the first taste of freedom, which is paired with the confusion of just wandering in the wilderness, no idea who we are or where we're headed, to the particular challenges which are mostly centered around the experience of disillusionment associated with abundance. That's sort of the promised land. And then finally into the release of liberation, freedom, which is where we'll be hanging out today. Because today's talk is centered around a nuanced and surprisingly complicated question to answer, which is just this. What are we talking about when we talk about freedom? The story begins in Egypt, and the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, and it means constriction, a narrow place. In the Hebrew imagination, Egypt isn't just a geographical location, it's a spiritual condition. It's the spiritual condition of the ego under pressure. In the story, life in Egypt is painful but relatively simple. The entire organizing principle is the Pharaoh. Everything is centered around Pharaoh. And if you look closely, you notice that the Pharaoh doesn't actually care what you do. As long as there's production, as long as there's movement, as long as there's a pervasive sense of urgency, enough demand and stimulation to keep us active enough that we don't engage with, reality and reality's essential questions, but primarily like, what am I doing here? Is this even what I want to be doing with my life? Like, who am I actually? Pharaoh's primary concern is generating enough motion that questions like that are rarely ever asked, and if they are, they're quickly dismissed because there's just too many other things to think about. Ain't nobody got time for that. And I'd wager that you have lived long enough now to have experienced your own pharaohs. They're all over the place. In suburban homes and corporate settings and, sadly, spiritual communities. So you probably met the pharaoh out there. And I'm also willing to wager that you've come in contact with the pharaohs in here. Most of mine seem to live in here. COVID, like that whole crisis there of some time back, was profoundly helpful for me and many people that I've talked to, in helping to locate and to then like experience some liberation from the pharaohs that live out there. Something about like our church, Beaches Vineyard, back in the day, I think we took like 4 weeks off during COVID, and we all laughed about the fact that churches were somehow not deemed essential businesses, that we had to close for a little while, but like the liquor stores stayed open. I don't know what the logic is there, but we had a solid month of like no activity, and then kind of a slow on-ramp back onto church life as it once was. And I just like, over that little brief period of time, I noticed personally like how many plates I was spinning, how many chainsaws I was juggling, how much activity that to me felt necessary vocationally and like significant or important spiritually for me and the community, that required my attention and that pulled me away from the center of myself and like my home and my family. And it wasn't until those activities became no longer an option that I was able to discern what I always knew was true and what like Jess, my wife, consistently told me, which can really be boiled down to like, is this necessary? Is this the place that this amount of life energy, like your one wild life, should this much of it be channeled into this one place? My answer was always yes. COVID helped me see that behind what I thought and hoped was a free yes tied to a genuine belief in the purpose and significance and importance of what I was doing was actually just fear dressed up in righteous clothing. Not that the work was meaningless, but like as soon as it was no longer a possibility to continue operating at the rate at which I had become accustomed, I started to notice that like I'm juggling chainsaws that nobody's asking me to, or maybe somebody asked me to pick it up and make sure that I keep a handle on it, but then they forgot that they ever asked me, and then I'm still doing it. And so when it was no longer an option to keep moving at that speed, what I noticed was nobody was really missing 2/3 of what I was doing, not least of all myself. And I learned in that season to actually be present to myself and to my kids and to my long-suffering wife. Presence to them stopped being a thing that I hoped was happening in some way, or that I would soon, clear my schedule enough to really like address and invest in, and it became like the option. And my soul woke up, and I saw that I had mistaken what felt like a pharaoh out there having demands on my time was largely a pharaoh in here who was terrified of being like inconsequential. The pharaoh, the internal tyrant, seems to be organized around a few familiar demands. Tell me which of these sound familiar to you. The need to feel secure, the need for approval, the need to like be liked, and the father Abraham of all needs, the need to feel like I'm in control. Now, these are all normal human desires. There's nothing innately wrong with them. In fact, a lot of times they're very helpful. But like most desires, they can make for like wonderful friends, but they're terrible masters. See, Egypt is the place where your life is driven rather than chosen. Egypt is the place where you do what's necessary for survival, just to keep going, to keep this thing moving, until you can't go on like that anymore, until the bottom finally falls out. And when we finally break, when we hit that point, we've already depleted our internal resources to a point that there's no energy for reorganization, or to finally begin to take our spiritual life seriously, to do a complete personality overhaul. There's no gas in the engine. There's no juice for that anymore. And what we experience is something parallel to the Hebrew experience in Egypt, which is, what's the saying that like we change when it becomes more painful to stay the same than it is to change? You know, that's sort of the moment the switch is flipped. We see this in the Hebrew people, and the birthplace of change, the seeds of freedom, where freedom actually begins, isn't this noble rallying cry that generates the self-transformation we've always longed for. It's a whimper, it's a plea, it's a gentle, like, acknowledgement that we're in over our heads and we're going to need help. It's this help. It's a help me. It seems like desperation is the birthplace of freedom, regardless of how embarrassing a look desperation is. Desperation is the birthplace of freedom. And from there, from that place of desperation, like, life finally gets easier, which is what we see is not what we see in the story at all. The first taste of freedom leads into a place that's called the wilderness. Wilderness is in Hebrew is a word called midbar, the midbar. And it's got an interesting little cocktail of meanings. Like, why don't you let these just swirl together in your imagination for a minute and see how it tastes. Midbar, depending on context, can mean devastation. Can also mean vastness, openness. And it also means the word, the voice of God. So the first taste of freedom is not like a victory lap for the ego. The first taste of freedom is the wilderness, and the wilderness is the place where the ego is finally dethroned. And this is a necessary but inherently painful process. Because in the wilderness, the big bad Pharaoh is finally gone. But then we have to notice and reckon with the reality that, he was kind of just a scapegoat. The Pharaoh out there was kind of just a scapegoat. In the confusion of the wilderness, we're meant to discover that the interior tyrant, the Pharaoh in here, is alive and well. Well, alive, well, and angry. Because in the wilderness, there are no systems, no metrics, no maps, nothing to prop up any lingering, stubborn illusions of control. This is because in the wilderness is the place where the old systems have evaporated, like well before any new systems appear. The inner Pharaoh wants security, provision, and he gets manna. Manna is a Hebrew word that means, what is this? It's like, I'm being cared for by something I can't understand. Manna, it's fascinating. My friend Brent, actually, after the teaching on Sunday, reminded me that, as is true with most things, what's most important is tone. Because we can ask, what is this? What is this? Like, it's a thing we have to solve. But manna refuses to be solved. You may remember, it's like this mysterious substance. It's like there's the dew, there's the morning dew out in the desert. And then as the sun comes up and the dew begins to evaporate, what is formed are these mysterious, like bread-like objects. They're manna. And they have a neutral taste, but they have enough nutrients to feed everybody. There's always enough for everybody. But The trick is you can't store it up. There's no 401k in the wilderness. If you try to take a little stash of manna and stick it in some jars and keep it for tomorrow, just in case, because who knows when the miracle's going to run out of juice, and I'd better be prepared. You know that voice? It just spoils. It rots. There's no way to save it for tomorrow. There's only enough for today. And every morning when we wake up, we discover that there is enough for today, until the part of us that wants to make sure that there's enough for tomorrow too calms down. We continue to experience a completely unnecessary anxiety. So the tone is important, as Brent reminded me, because we can say, what is this? What is this? Like it's something to be solved. Or we can flip it and say, what is this? As it's a curiosity to be marveled at, participated in. The inner Pharaoh wants certainty, wants a map, wants some idea of where we're being led, and you know what he gets instead? He gets a pillar of smoke to follow. To follow where? To the promised land. And where's that again? The inner Pharaoh wants answers, and instead receives presents, and continues to receive presents until the self awakens to the truth that presence is all we've ever wanted all along. Enough time in the wilderness and you start to ask questions like, is this karma? Is this punishment? But the wilderness isn't punishment. The wilderness is deprogramming. The test in the wilderness is uncertainty. Will we trust presence in the absence of any kind of guarantee? And then finally, after 40 years of wandering, comes the arrival in the promised land. Promised land comes from a root in Hebrew that means security or confidence or trust. It means to feel safe. It means to rely on. It means to let go. And as Israel enters the promised land, they engage a different kind of test. In Egypt, the danger was oppression. In wilderness, the danger was despair. In the promised land, the danger is forgetfulness, because when there's finally enough food, when there's finally enough safety, and finally something that feels a little bit like stability, Moses warns them, be careful not to say, this is all happening because of me. I figured it out. I cracked the code. I cut a new key to the kingdom. Israel finds out, as we all do eventually, that the promised land isn't the solution. That shalom isn't the absence of fear. Shalom isn't absolute detachment or certainty. That shalom is a radical acceptance of reality as it actually is, that reorients our life in a way that we're liberated to participate with our life as it actually stands, rather than constantly striving to perfect it or to escape it or to arrive at some magical place of permanence. So freedom doesn't mean I serve nothing. Like Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. Remember Dylan went through that radical evangelical Christian phase in the 70s that confounded his fans? That was through the Vineyard movement, which we were a part of, actually. He wrote 4 albums that have been maligned by most critics, but actually have a few bangers on them. One of them being this song, You Gotta Serve Somebody. It's just the ego's lot in life. Freedom doesn't mean I serve nobody. That's not an option for the ego. What freedom means is that I consciously choose where I place my allegiance. Here's Richard Rohr. He wrote, "You're only free when you have nothing to protect and nothing that you need to prove or defend. Trapped people think they have to do what they want to do. Free people want to do what they know that they have to do. Sit with that for a second. See, Exodus, it turns out, is not a story of escape. It's the story of allegiance. It's the story of the awakening of a consciousness strong enough to choose surrender and to choose to whom or what it will surrender. In the Hebrew imagination, freedom is a life of allegiance to presence, which inherently involves the exchange of predictability for adaptiveness. In John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden, there's a passage that is so beautiful, I'm just going to read it to you verbatim. It goes like this. Sometimes a kind of glory lights up the mind of a man, and it happens to nearly everybody. You can feel it growing or preparing, like a fuse burning toward dynamite. It's a feeling in the stomach, a delight of the nerves, of the forearms. The skin tastes the air, and every deep-drawn breath is sweet. Its beginning has the pleasure of a great stretching yawn. It flashes in the brain, and the whole world glows outside your eyes. A man may have lived all of his life in the gray, and the land and trees of him dark and somber. The events, even the important ones, may have trooped by faceless and pale. And then the glory, so that a cricket song sweetens his ears. The smell of the earth rises chanting to his nose, and dappling light under a tree blesses his eyes. Then a man pours outward, a torrent of him, and yet he's not diminished. And I guess a man's importance in the world can be measured by the quality and the number of his glories. It's a lonely thing, but it relates us to the world. It's the mother of all creativeness, and it sets each man separate from all other men. And I think Steinbeck is reaching for, courageously trying to describe what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven, which is maybe the most misunderstood phrase in the history of humankind. You would think that Jesus, whatever your thoughts on Jesus, Son of God, fictional character, wise teacher, whatever you think of Jesus, I think that most of us can agree that he was probably a pretty effective teacher, given that his message persists. He was born to immigrant refugees. He grew up in poverty. He was potentially a homeless guy. He never wrote anything down except for a few words in the sand. And yet, our calendar is based on his birth. And his voice has shaped Western civilization, and to a large degree Eastern, more than maybe anybody else. The dude was probably an effective teacher, right? And why do none of us, how can there still be so much arguing over what exactly it is that he meant by the kingdom of heaven? Even those closest to him, his disciples, his best friends, some of them went to their grave with what appears to be a grievous misunderstanding of what Jesus was actually talking about. See, the kingdom of heaven isn't a place, it's a perspective. It's a way of seeing. And it's a way of seeing reality as it actually is, which is inherently beautiful and good and blessed, just like you. And we've all had, like Steinbeck says, these moments of seeing where the world lights up in a different way, and you couldn't make it or call it ugly if you tried. Everything is beautiful just as it is, and everything belongs. And some deep, familiar series of knots inside the soul, aggravations and problems and regrets and mistakes and, obvious errors, in life just seem to untie themselves naturally, evaporate. And the problems that like haunt us and plague us and seem to define our lives become almost comical in light of the experience of union. And these are moments and events that we can't manufacture and we can't chase, though there's whole economic ecosystems built on the pursuit of these experiences. I've heard it called like spiritual materialism. We can't generate them, we can't make them happen, we can't contain them, we can't program them, we can't schedule them. They're grace. We can't force the bud to blossom, but we can cultivate good gardening practices that prepare the soil for processes that are ultimately beyond our control. We can practice stillness. We can welcome silence. We can choose to continue to trust, to wait just a moment more before acting.